In April 2025, the United States announced one of the broadest tariff packages in modern trade history. China was hit. The European Union was hit. Japan was hit. South Korea was hit. But some of the highest proposed tariff rates were not aimed at the usual suspects. Cambodia, 49%. Laos, 48%. Vietnam, 46%. Myanmar, 44%. Four of the hardest-hit economies were in Southeast Asia. That was not a coincidence. For years, Washington had been trying to reduce dependence on China, and Southeast Asia was supposed to be part of the answer. Move some factories out of China, build in Vietnam, assemble in Thailand, source from Malaysia, invest in Indonesia. But by 2025, Southeast Asia was no longer just the escape route from the US-China trade war. It had become part of the trade war itself. This is the story of how Southeast Asia stopped being the world's quiet workshop and became one of its most contested economies. For most of the last 30 years, the global manufacturing map was easy to understand. There was China, and there was everywhere else. This was not just because Chinese labor was cheap. That explanation is too simple. China became powerful because it built an entire manufacturing system. Factories, suppliers, ports, roads, industrial parks, tool makers, engineers, local governments that competed for investment. If a company needed one missing component, it might be available a few hours away. If a production line broke, someone could fix it quickly. If an order suddenly increased, suppliers could scale. That is what people often misunderstand about supply chains. A factory is not just a building. A factory is part of a system. And for a long time, China had the best system. By 2018, China made roughly a third of global manufacturing output. Apple built most of its iPhones there. Walmart shelves were filled through Chinese supply chains. IKEA warehouses, electronic stores, car interiors, household appliances, industrial parts, all of it depended on Chinese production. Southeast Asia, in that old order, had a different role. It supplied inputs. It assembled lower-end goods. It produced garments, shoes, electronics components, rubber, palm oil, coal, gas, and agricultural exports. It attracted factories, but it was usually not the center of the story. Then came 2018, and the first Trump trade war. At first, the tariffs on Chinese goods looked like a cost problem. Annoying, maybe temporary, but manageable. Then COVID happened. Factories shut down, ports clogged, shipping costs jumped, and companies discovered that the cheapest supply chain was not always the safest supply chain. For decades, the logic of globalization had been efficiency. Produce where it is cheapest, ship where it is needed, keep inventories low, trust that the system will keep moving. After the trade war and the pandemic, the logic changed. The new word was resilience. Companies did not necessarily want to leave China. They wanted a backup. That strategy became known as China plus one. China plus Vietnam, China plus Thailand, China plus Malaysia, China plus Indonesia, China plus India or Mexico. Southeast Asia became one of the most obvious choices. Vietnam had labor, ports, industrial parks, and proximity to southern China. Thailand had an established automotive base. Malaysia had electronics and semiconductor experience. Indonesia had minerals, land, and a huge domestic market. And Singapore had finance, logistics, law, and regional headquarters. So from the outside, the story looked simple. The world was moving production away from China and into Southeast Asia. But that was only half true. The part that makes this story complicated is that a lot of the money moving into Southeast Asia was not replacing China. It was coming from China. In 2023, Chinese companies announced about $26.4 billion in greenfield investment across ASEAN. That was more than the United States, Japan, and South Korea combined. And the sectors were not random. Electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, electronics, industrial components. The exact industries now caught in the middle of global technology and trade competition. For Chinese companies, Southeast Asia offered three advantages. First, proximity. Factories in Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia can still connect to Chinese supplier networks. Second, growth. Southeast Asia is not only a production base, it is also a market of hundreds of millions of consumers. And third, access. A product finished in Southeast Asia may be treated differently from a product exported directly from China. Chinese components, ASEAN assembly, American consumer. This is where trade becomes political. A product made entirely in China is one thing, but what about a product assembled in Vietnam using Chinese parts? Or a solar panel finished in Malaysia using Chinese inputs? Or an electric vehicle made in Thailand by a Chinese company? Is that a Vietnamese product? A Malaysian product? A Thai product? Or a Chinese product with extra steps? That question is now worth billions of dollars. This is why the April 2025 tariffs mattered. They showed that Washington was no longer only targeting China directly. It was also targeting the supply chain around China. Vietnam is the clearest example. Vietnam became one of the biggest winners of China Plus One. Electronics, footwear, furniture, apparel, and components moved into the country. But that success created a new vulnerability. The more Vietnam exported to America, the more Washington cared about what was actually inside those exports. Later in 2025, the United States and Vietnam reached a framework where many Vietnamese goods would face a 20% tariff. But goods considered transshipped through Vietnam would face a 40% tariff. That second number is the important one, because it means the fight is no longer just about finished goods. It is about the origin of every input. A shoe is not just a shoe. A laptop is not just a laptop. A battery is not just a battery. Customs officials, companies, and governments now have to ask, where did the components come from? Where was the value added? Who owns the factory? Who supplied the machinery? Who controls the chain? This is how Southeast Asia became contested. Not because it is replacing China, but because it is where China, America, Japan, Korea, Europe, India, and local ASEAN economies now overlap. Southeast Asia is not powerful because it is one unified economy. It is powerful because it offers many different strategic assets in one region. Vietnam is a manufacturing platform. Thailand is an automotive and industrial base. Malaysia is important for electronics, chips, and data centers. Indonesia has nickel, coal, palm oil, copper, and a massive consumer market. Singapore is the region's financial and logistics control room. The Philippines has services, outsourcing, English-speaking labor, and strategic geography. Cambodia and Laos are deeply connected to Chinese infrastructure and manufacturing networks. And Myanmar remains strategically located, even while its economy is under severe political stress. This is not a single machine, it is a network, and the scale is already large. In 2024, ASEAN's total goods trade reached about $3.8 trillion. Exports were about $1.95 trillion, imports about $1.89 trillion. Foreign direct investment into ASEAN rose to around $226 billion, even while global FDI declined. So investors are not just talking about Southeast Asia, they are moving money there. Factories need land. Ports need financing. Data centers need electricity. Mines need processing plants. Startups need capital. Governments need infrastructure. This is why every major power has a reason to care. China wants influence and supply chain flexibility. America wants to reduce dependence on China. Japan wants to preserve its long industrial position in the region. South Korea wants manufacturing depth. Europe wants trade access. And India wants to pull factories toward itself. And Southeast Asian countries? They want to take money from all of them, without becoming controlled by any one of them. That is the core tension. Southeast Asia's strategy has usually been hedging, not choosing one side too clearly. Take Japanese infrastructure. Accept Chinese capital, sell to American consumers, welcome Korean manufacturers, negotiate with Europe, and use ASEAN diplomacy to avoid being swallowed by any single power. For a long time, that strategy worked, but the world is becoming less forgiving. Tariffs are becoming sharper. Rules of origin are becoming stricter. Export controls are becoming more political. Critical minerals are becoming strategic. Technology is becoming a security issue. And that creates a problem for ASEAN. The region is connected, but it is not unified. It does not have one currency. It does not have one legal system. It does not have one foreign policy. It does not have one industrial strategy. Vietnam's priorities are not Singapore's priorities. Indonesia's priorities are not Thailand's. Cambodia's position is not the same as Malaysia's. And the Philippines does not think about China the same way Laos does. This fragmentation makes ASEAN difficult, but it also gives the region flexibility. Different countries can absorb different parts of the global economy. Factories in Vietnam, nickel in Indonesia, finance in Singapore, chips in Malaysia, cars in Thailand, services in the Philippines, infrastructure in Cambodia and Laos. That is why Southeast Asia is hard to ignore. It is not one replacement for China. It is many partial answers to the problems China created. So, how did Southeast Asia become the world's most contested economy? It was not sudden. China became too central. The United States became more suspicious. Companies became afraid of dependence. Tariffs changed the math. Technology became political. Minerals became strategic. And trade rules began following supply chains into places that used to sit quietly in the background. Southeast Asia became important because it sits in the middle of all of this, between China and the United States, between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, between factories and consumers, between raw materials and advanced manufacturing, between capital and politics. The region did not ask to become the answer to the China question, but increasingly, it is. And over the next decade, the most important question may not be whether companies leave China. It may be what kind of economy Southeast Asia becomes after they arrive.